I'm James Turk. I'm a director of the GoldMoney Foundation, and I'm here today with Jim Rickards, Senior Managing Director of Tangent Capital. Jim, a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.
We're here at the GATA conference. There's a news announcement just out that the European Central Bank is intervening in the market to buy Italian bonds. What's your reaction?
Well, it's really, so I call it sequential hostage taking by the markets. We saw it starting in Greece and then Ireland and Portugal and Italy. And the problem for Europe, every time they bail out one of these economies or come up with some arrangement or bond exchange or extended maturity, there are different techniques for doing it. But every time they put out one fire, they assume that the whole thing is over, that they've sent a message to the markets that they're going to do this, they're going to keep the euro together and prop up these sovereign borrowers, and so the markets should relax. But the markets don't relax. What they do is they say, well, thank you very much for buying our Greek bonds. Now we're going to up the ante and we're going to attack Italy and force you to buy our Italian bonds. I think what's going on, James, is that the markets are basically trying to force the sovereigns to lift their positions. Obviously they take a loss, but if it's 70 or 80 cents on the dollar, that's a lot better than what the market might bear, which might be down 50 or even 40 cents on the dollar. So it's as if the markets and the banks are forcing the governments to lift their positions one by one. What's going to happen in the end game is that the ECB and the European Stabilization Fund are going to own all the sovereign bonds in Europe. They will owe themselves money, and then it's not clear where it goes from there. You either unload that on the taxpayers directly, or you inflate the currency and, in effect, steal from your own citizens. So it's going to have a bad ending, but it'll play out over years.
What is it that the politicians don't recognize and that the market recognizes? Are they just being poorly advised, or do they have something in their mind that is taking them in a direction completely opposite of what the market's looking at?
It's a really good question. I think it's a number of factors. Some of it's just wishful thinking. Look, what does it take to be a successful politician? Well, probably not the same thing it takes to be a PhD economist or a capital markets expert. So they get into these positions and don't really have any background in economics necessarily. Some of them do, of course, but not a lot of them. Then they get advisors, but the advisors sort of adhere to the conventional wisdom. Then there's sort of short-termism. Well, just get me through the next election cycle. I don't really care that much about what's going to happen in 5 years or 10 years. Then there's some wishful thinking, just hoping for the best without really being rigorous or analytical about that. So there are a number of factors that come into play, but I think you're right that what's not happening is people are not confronting the problem, candidly, honestly, the way they should. And perhaps some of those who are not willing to talk about it. Certainly our central bankers are not going to come out and say, well, sorry, the country's broke, but that's the reality in some of these cases.
How did the European Central Bank become a hostage of politicians? Because, the EU rules were set up that it was going to be independent like the Bundesbank, and that the euro would not be involved with political influence, so it would be managed like the Deutschmark. But, the euro is obviously being politically influenced, and the ECB is being, I think, politically influenced as well by politicians. How did this evolve?
Well, again, a good question. I think there are two answers to it. One goes back 60 years, which is the euro has always been primarily a political project. It is an economic project. It's a monetary project, of course, but it's always been a political project. It's been about avoiding war in Europe. I mean, you take the long view. Go back to the Counter-Reformation in the mid-16th century. You had a bloody Counter-Reformation. You had the Napoleonic Wars, the Wars of Louis XIV, the 7 Years' War, the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, World War II, the Holocaust. By the time European civilization got to the late 40s and early 50s, they were literally exhausted. I mean, they'd been fighting for 400 years. So they said, well, this is crazy, and it's just going to happen again. So we have to find some way to prevent it. So their theory was economic integration would be the antidote to political disintegration and warfare. So that's the big picture view of Europe, starting with France and Germany as the core and extending outward from there. So that's sort of one aspect to it. So there's a very strong historical and political dimension to this, that the leaders do not want the euro to fall apart. They do, of course it would make sense for Greece to leave the euro, go back to the drachma, devalue their currency. I remember going to Greece decades ago, and I couldn't spend $100 a day. I'd stay in the best hotel, eat in great restaurants, take taxis, go shopping, and I couldn't spend $100 a day. And that's always been Greece's solution, encourage tourism, encourage exports, et cetera. Well, they can't do that anymore. But so there's some logic to leaving the euro, but Europe does not want them to. They don't want anyone to leave because they've accomplished some of their goals. But the other aspect of it really is more purely economic, which Germany gets enormous advantage from being part of the euro, because in effect, the rest of Europe is not competitive with Germany. So Germany has always been able to export very heavily, even in a strong currency environment. You go back to the Deutschmark in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. The Deutschmark went up significantly against the dollar, and yet Germany was still an export powerhouse because they're efficient, because their technology, because labor and business management work together. So they have an ability to power through an appreciating currency. The rest of Europe doesn't, but that's okay with Germany because they have captive markets. You know, Italy's not going to start a company like Siemens. Greece is not going to start an aircraft company. So they sort of have the best of both worlds. So I think for political and economic reasons, that Germany is willing to subsidize Europe and does not want the euro to break up.
You know, I agree about the economic integration, and I agree that one of the objectives has been to, you know, prevent war, and everybody lives happily together, and economic integration is a key element to that because everyone raises their standards of living the way the market works, by interchange and creating opportunities for commerce. But there's another element to it as well, and a good evidence of that is the way the Bundesbank was created by the Allies after the Second World War. They made it completely politically independent from the government because both the world wars were financed by money printing by the German central bank. The best way to fight to avoid a third world war is to make the Bundesbank completely independent, and so it was until 2000, and that's one of the reasons why the Deutschmark had a pretty good record over that period of time. But despite that, and despite the EU rules, we're going back to the situation now where the ECB is under control of politicians, which is exactly the opposite of the way the Bundesbank was run, and is now, you know, also against logic in terms of keeping politicians away from the printing press, because they're ultimately going to destroy the currency by doing crazy things like buying bonds of Greece.
Right. Well, there's a very interesting dynamic going on in the ECB right now, and I agree, James, with your sort of big picture analysis. But remember, Jean-Claude Trichet leaves October 30th, and Mario Draghi comes in as the new head of the ECB. So Trichet is really a short timer at this point. He's only got 3 months left. So he's got a very good track record so far, despite the difficulties. He's not going to want to go out on an inflationary note. He's not going to cut interest rates. He's not going to print a lot of money. He's going to hold the line, and he'll leave with his reputation intact for being a sort of a classic old school central banker. So the political pressure you're talking about, and you're right, there is that kind of political pressure, it's all going to fall on Mario Draghi, and we'll see how he does. I don't know whether the Italian French thing makes a difference, but he's certainly handpicked, and he's going to be the recipient of all the political pressure you're talking about. Now, there is another element in place, very significant, it just happened, which is, of course, that it's very obvious from the start that Europe had, or at least the members of the Euro system, had a unified monetary policy, but they had all these diverse fiscal policies. And you know, Greece and some of these other countries, Ireland, et cetera, got themselves in a lot of trouble. Now, my analogy is to the United States, where we have one Federal Reserve and one Treasury. And the Federal Reserve sets monetary policy, and the Treasury, along with the Congress and the White House, obviously, take care of fiscal policy and do all the borrowing. You've never had a Euro Treasury. I think today we do. It just happened in the past month that the ESFS, the European Stability Fund, that was set up, it looks like a sort of special purpose bailout mechanism, and it's not called the European Treasury, but that's what it is. You have a European Treasury run by Germany for the first time. Germany is going to dictate fiscal policy to the rest of Europe. I call this the financial Fourth Reich, and people get upset when you use a phrase like the Fourth Reich, but I say, well, remember the First Reich, which was Charlemagne and, by extension, the Holy Roman Empire. Germany has conquered Europe financially without a shot being fired, is something they've sort of always aspired to. So from now on, this is the flip side of the bailout. Now see, Greece right now likes the bailout because the austerity is not going to be as bad as it was. The bond market is not going to collapse. The Greek banking system is not going to collapse. All those things were in play. Now they've been taken off the table because this fund is going to use European credit at 3–4% to finance Greece and give Greece, maybe they'll charge Greece 5%, but they're not going to charge Greece 20%, which is what the market was going to charge them. So they've been able to extend the European credit to Greece. But the other side of that is over time, they're going to dictate fiscal policy to the Greeks. They're going to say, you need to privatize this, you need to sell this, you need to take a hard line with these unions, you don't start an aircraft company, don't do certain things. And that's all going to be dictated by Germany. It was not democratic, nobody voted on it, but that's where we are. And now that's going to extend through all of Europe. So I think that the big news, and this happened very recently, is that the new improved version of the ESFS is in effect a German-controlled European treasury.
So you think the euro is going to survive by implication? In terms of
I do. I think it's going to survive, and I'm very bullish on the euro for a number of reasons. Notwithstanding all this sovereign debt crisis that we're all very well aware of, a couple of reasons. Number one, the one I just mentioned, which is that they now are going to have a unified, coordinated fiscal policy through this ESFS. Number two, it's never been economically driven. It's been politically driven, and the political dynamic hasn't changed. And number three is gold. The euro system has more gold than the United States. You know, we have our 8,133 tons. The euro system has over 10,000 tons. So they've got a backstop for their currency that China, Japan, UK, Brazil, and a lot of other countries, Russia, and other countries don't have. So I think they don't want to go to gold, and they'll only do it as a last resort. But the gold is there, so they do have something behind their currency.
Well, they have 10,000 tons of gold and gold receivables. The central banks don't actually report how much they have in the vault and how much they have out on loan.
Right.
So we really don't know how much of that is really there and intact. And just like in the United States, where there's no independent third-party audit of the gold, to my knowledge, with the exception of a couple of European countries like Switzerland, there is no independent verification of how much gold really exists.
Right. Well, I'm all for transparency. I'm all for independent audits. I think those audits should take place. I think that those statements should be released. They should come from independent parties. So I'm all in favor of that. Having said that, I have absolutely no reason to believe that the gold is not there. This notion that it's tungsten bars or it's...
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about gold being loaned out, melted down into jewelry and sold to women in India.
But that's not the way the gold loan market works. The way it works is that so I'm a depository. I'm Fort Knox, or I'm West Point, or I'm the ECB, or I've got some gold. You're a bank. You're some party you want to transact in the market.